Now on BBC World News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
Rising prices, falling shares. Global stock markets are in line for their worst week in 2 years amid growing concerns about inflation. We'll be live in New York with the latest. The World Trade Organization passes a package of deals on COVID vaccines, fishing subsidies and food. But is it a triumph for talking or a compromise too far? Hello, you're with World Business Report. I'm Jonathan Josephs. Welcome to you wherever in the world you're watching from. The world's stock markets are on course for their worst week in 2 years. The big sell-off is being driven by investors' concerns over the impact of rising prices. That's something that was triggered by the pandemic and has been made worse by the war in Ukraine. And it's led more than 60 central banks to increase the cost of borrowing this year. Significantly, that includes the big rise from the US Federal Reserve this week. Now, as you can see, it's having a bit of an impact on the markets. A bit of positive news now in Europe in the trading session that's ongoing there. Perhaps some investors looking for some bargains after the sales that we've seen this week. And if we move the board on, we should be able to see in the US where trading is getting underway now. These were the closing prices yesterday. As you can see, big falls across the board, and that was continued in Japan overnight. So, is there any more positive news here on Friday as the session gets underway? Well, let's bring in our business correspondent, Michelle Fleury, who joins us from New York. Michelle, it's not looking like a great Friday when you think about the context of the week for investors. Not a joyous weekend in store. But what more can policymakers do to help ease some of those concerns that investors have quite clearly got?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, what we have here is high inflation and a hot labour market, and that's forcing central banks around the world, as you just mentioned, to increase rates. And so we're bringing to an end this period of extremely low interest rates, and that's having a huge impact on financial markets and the way asset prices are sort of evaluated. People are kind of jumping out of risky assets. In terms of policymakers, there's not much that can be done about that. I think that's sort of part of this process, is you are going to get this kind of repricing of assets, so investors getting out of riskier bets that perhaps, they don't make such sense in an environment where you can earn more money elsewhere. In terms of the broader economy, though, here's the thing. Interest rates, obviously, by raising the cost of borrowing, can influence the demand side. Consumers may, for example, cut back on spending if it's going to cost more to borrow money. But they can't do much about the supply side. And I think that's the interesting part of this. You've got Biden basically talking down, saying we're doing all we can to address inflation. But in reality, there is more the administration and Congress could be doing. And we saw US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying, look, one way we could ease supply constraints is if Congress did more to provide funding for things like infrastructure, education, and reducing drug prices.
Thank you very much, Michelle Fleury in New York. I hope you have a more favourable weekend than some of those investors who've seen big losses. Now let's move on to events in Geneva, where the world's trade ministers have reached a series of agreements that the head of the World Trade Organization says will make a difference to the lives of people around the world. Despite mounting trade tensions, the pandemic means it was the first such gathering for nearly 5 years. The 164 countries who make up the WTO agreed deals on access to COVID vaccines, fishing subsidies and food exports. Now, our global trade correspondent Darshini David has been speaking to me earlier, and I asked her how much of a breakthrough the deal on COVID vaccines actually is.
Many of us who are in Geneva, as I was earlier this week, can't deny the commitment that went into trying to get agreement between 164 different countries on this and a number of issues. And up until even perhaps hours ago, it looked pretty uncertain whether we were going to get any agreement whatsoever. So we can't deny this is, as the WTO says, a triumph on some level. But as you say, there's a number of things to look at here. And when we're looking specifically at the issues around vaccine waivers when it comes to intellectual property, the big question is, does this really solve the problem? And the problem is that at the moment, 10 billion doses of these vaccines, less than 1% of those going to the very poorest countries. And there's not much this can change, perhaps, in the shorter term. Because if you look at what's actually been agreed here, for the next 5 years, the recipe behind those vaccines can be shared amongst producers in other countries. But the real problem at the moment, one official was flagging to me, is that we've currently got a surplus of COVID vaccines. The problem is how you get them out there to the people who most need them. So perhaps more effective would be an agreement for more cash to be spent by richer nations to make sure there's the infrastructure to deliver these doses around the world, and the know-how as well. And don't forget, of course, this agreement doesn't go as far as covering other areas, for example, tests and treatments for pandemics. And this whole deal was about looking at past pandemics and future and how you prepare for those. So there's a long way to go.
So a lot of progress there, much heralded. But there were also a bunch of other agreements. Run us through those briefly. And just what does all of this achievement mean for the World Trade Organization, which coming into this meeting was facing a lot of criticism that it wasn't really relevant, it wasn't achieving anything much for the world's population? Does this now make it a relevant organization with all the trade tensions that we have going on around the world?
Well, it's been interesting, as you say, a number of areas here. So, for example, we've got some agreement on reducing fishing subsidies, a rollover of agreement which keeps tariffs off e-commerce, things like digital products such as films and software, also other areas as well, some limited lifting of export controls which will help the likes of the World Food Programme feed the poorest in the world. So you can't say that this isn't an organisation which doesn't have some effectiveness and relevance. I mean, we saw what happened this week alone, which, in the face of a war in Ukraine and a cost of living crisis, it's making a material difference here. But what it does underscore is how difficult it is to get agreement when you're making those decisions on the basis of consensus between nations with very differing needs and demands out there. And the really tricky issues, well, they've been thrown onto next year and the next conference, I'm afraid to say.
Our global trade correspondent Darshini David there. Now, as we've been hearing there, the World Trade Organization has reached that deal, which includes limiting restrictions on food exports. It comes as the chief economist of the World Food Programme has told the BBC the world has been too reliant on a few key food exporters and must increase the number of countries that food comes from. Dr. Arif Hussain was speaking to my colleague Aaron Heselhurst and began by telling him just how bad the global food crisis is.
On a scale of 1 to 10, this is 10 plus. And the reason why I say that, and I don't say that very lightly, is because Ukraine is a food basket, a global food basket for about 400 million people. And when that gets disrupted, you feel the repercussions, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
Do you think the UN, the World Food Programme, have been too reliant on one source nation for its supplies? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, 40% of wheat aid you used to get from Ukraine.
No, I would say the world has been too reliant on very few exporters. When you look at your wheat, corn, soybean, coarse grains like millet and sorghum, less than 10 countries provide like 80-90% of that grain. Less than 5 countries hold the stock up to 80-90% of those grains. When any shock happens to any of these big ones, you find the repercussions around the world. So one lesson which comes out of this crisis is that we must diversify our export base, enlarge our export base, so we are not in this type of situation going forward. Same goes for reserves. Here's the funny thing. As an investor, you would never just buy one stock or one class, asset category. You would diversify. That would be the smart thing to do, no? But for global food security, we are not diversified. How does this make sense? And what really bothers me is that this is not a new issue. We went through this in 2008. We went through this in 2011. We went through this in COVID. And now again.
So we're not good at learning our lessons.
No, we are not. And you know what? Let me just say that I hope that countries rethink their agricultural policies, countries rethink their energy policies. If not for the environmental sake, rethink it from your economic security and your political security.
And you can see more of that interview with World Food Programme's chief economist, Dr. Arif Hussain, on Talking Business with Aaron Hazelhurst this weekend on BBC World News. You can see the times here. The first one's 23:30 GMT on Saturday. That's all for now, but plenty more on the website. Thanks for watching.
I'm Sophie Ikenya in Kenya, and we'll be coming live all week from the continent with a special series of programs marking the 10-year anniversary of Focus on Africa TV. So for a focused look at how the continent could look like in the